Alright, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jordan Kramer.
Cheyenne Miller.
Stephen Vegas.
Hope Gallagher.
And today our presentation is going to be on education, not incarceration, and our plans to help decrease the school to prison pipeline. So, what exactly is the pipeline? That's something that you obviously need to know for the remainder of the presentation. According to tolerance.org, it is policies that encourage police presence at schools, harsh tactics including physical restraint, and automatic punishments that result in suspensions and out-of-class time.
Alright, so I'm going to be talking about kind of the factors that contribute to the school-to-prison pipeline. So, as a school social work major, my particular field would be sociology. So I guess from a sociological standpoint, we kind of look at, why things are the way that they are. Nothing is can really be taken at face value. Everything is because of the root of something else. And so the three main things that we saw that contribute to the school-to-prison pipeline are zero tolerance policies, the militarization of schools, and racial bias. Mike, are you paying attention? So the first part, zero tolerance policies, are that these policies are mandated consequences without necessarily considering the consequence of the situation. So teachers and school administrators are kind of dishing out punishments without even looking at the specific situation. So a lot of times this results in suspension and expulsion, and studies show that missing time from class is actually the factor that contributes most to low graduation rates. And also, obviously, missing class creates negative perceptions of school, so kids who miss class won't have a positive attitude towards education, as well as if they're missing class, they're more likely to get involved with crime. Obviously, if you have no adult supervision, you're suspended, you're on your own for the whole day, you're most likely going to get into something you're not supposed to. So those facts come from the article School to Prison Pipeline, an evaluation of zero tolerance policies and their alternatives. So next is the militarization of schools. I'll go through this quick. This just refers to the police presence in schools. So a lot of schools these days are looking more like correctional facilities than institutions of education, with armed police, metal detectors, pat-down stations, things like that. So obviously this psychology, this kind of hurts their psychological ability to learn if it's such a poor learning condition, and they feel like they're expected to fail. And then lastly, racial bias. We'll get into this a lot more later, but basically most of this is implicit, so people or teachers don't understand or don't even know that they're being biased towards minority students, and so they're more likely to give harsher punishments to minority students without even knowing. But again, we'll talk about that much more later.
So there are two groups who are disparagingly affected by the school-to-prison pipeline. Home Elias states that this is racial minorities and students with disabilities. On the higher end, it affects African Americans more as part of the racial minority groups, but there are also other racial minority groups within their different ethnicities that it affects, and students with disabilities that can range from a child with ADHD all the way to maybe a child who is on the autism spectrum or emotionally disabled.
So then just kind of bring it close to home, there was a study done by the Yale Child First Study Center, and they looked at the school year of 2015 to 2016, and for children that were from preschool to third grade, there's over 29,000 out-of-school suspensions just in Ohio. And then to also go back to what Stephen and Cheyenne were saying about the minority group and racial bias, of the expulsion for preschool to third graders, it was 100% African American males at that young of an age. The bias is already starting and building, and later we'll go into more research, but part of their study also, they did an eye tracking activity with teachers, and teachers are highly more likely to watch African American males more than any other students when they're suspected that they're going to be troublemakers. So for this study, they prompted the teachers by saying, this is a classroom of unruly students. So they didn't even say specific students or a certain group of them, but when the teachers believed that some of the students were going to have bad behavior, they were tracking the African American students, which goes back to the implicit bias that we will touch on later. And then so not only race but also gender, so African American males are at a higher risk than African American females, and as Cheyenne was saying, special needs students also are targeted in this. So then just kind of our vision for this presentation is we wanted to act out our action plan. So the things that we'll be doing in our presentations are the things that we believe need to be in our schools, need to be in our communities, in our law enforcement environments in order to make a change for this. So we're not going to go through and say exactly like a PowerPoint on an action plan, but we're acting it out. So to show not only that teachers need it, but also whatever field you're in, hopefully our presentation will be revealing that it is something that is vital for all of our lives. So we'll be doing that within our discipline. So Stephen and I will be taking the sociological and psychological part of that, and then Cheyenne and Jordan will be doing the general and special education teacher viewpoint on that.
So ideally this would be a training that they have to do each time that they renew their teacher's license to help kind of open teachers' eyes to these issues. And there's actually the article that I read called Managing Our Blind Spot, the Role of Bias in the School-to-Prison Pipeline. It mentioned that a Stanford study done by Stanford University looked at de-biasing training for teachers, and it resulted that de-biasing training could actually reduce school suspensions by 50% among minority students. So obviously this is effective. We got these activities from those articles, and so we're going to follow through and kind of go through our action plan here.
So the first part of it, we'll be talking on bias.
Alright, so this is the first activity. So you guys are going to get together in groups of 2 or 3. You 3, you 3, you 2, 2, 2. And if you've seen this before, if you know the answer, don't shout it out. And also keep it between your group too. So if you figure it out, don't tell it to another group. So just take 30 seconds to a minute here, read through this and try to figure it out. Micah, stop asking that.
Oh.
Group behind you there. Alright, so I'm sure some of you probably figured it out. Maybe you needed help from someone else in your group, but the surgeon is his mom. And so, how many of you guys got that? So 4 out of. So that's about right. So studies show that only about 40% will get this right.
Or he could have 2 dads.
Yeah, or could. So, well, that's what. So most
But
people.
even that then is still going into the
Against
bias
right,
that
yeah.
you wouldn't think of a woman to having that.
Yeah. So the point of
It
this
still
is to show
proves
that only 40% of people will acknowledge that a surgeon could be a woman, essentially. And so, while this doesn't strictly have to do with the school-to-prison pipeline and racial bias, it's a perfect example to transition us into the topic of implicit or unconscious bias, because even though everyone in here would deny that they're sexist, the fact that your first instinct is to think that the kid's adopted or two dads, something in that region, just shows that unconsciously we're a lot more, there's a lot more going on than we think.
Yeah, so we kind of were talking about this idea of the problem of the school-to-prison pipeline or things with race as a tree. So what we see mostly in our society is the problems of high minority incarceration, zero tolerance, school-to-prison pipeline. But what we don't think about it is the roots of the problem being the implicit bias and how that carries over to everything in our world today and the decisions that we make, the ways our policies and laws have been made, and the way that teachers and police officers deal with these situations. So now we're, as Stephen said, we're going to dig in deeper, but just think of that imagery of, yes, these are the outcomes of problems, but there's something deeper. So it's deeper than just fixing school-to-prison pipeline, but addressing the root of the issue.
Alright, so I guess a formal definition from the McNeil article of implicit bias. Basically, so individuals do not always have conscious, intentional control over the processes of social perception, impression formation, and judgment that motivate their actions. So basically, it's very possible that you have unconscious feelings towards one cultural group without even knowing. Research shows that these biases and stereotypes operate regardless of intent. Stereotypes automatically triggered by our normal cognitive processes, and people have very little control over these processes.
So that's, then here just see some more breakdown on what Steve was saying. So race, ability, gender, culture, and language. So all the different ways that attitudes, stereotypes, and bias can affect these different people groups and the impact that they have when it starts at such a young age in our schools. So now we have a video that's, or do you want to do that thing? Alright, so we have a video that kind of is going to talk about privilege and some things like that. You might have seen it. It's been circulating around.
Hey, line up! Line up! Everybody line up! We're about to race! Everybody line up! Shoulder to shoulder! Take off your backpacks! Basketball, line up! We're about to race! Hey, we are racing for a $100 bill. The winner of this race will take this. A $100 bill. Before I say go, I'm going to make a couple statements. If those statements apply to you, I want you to take 2 steps forward. If those statements don't apply to you, I want you to stay right where you're at. Take 2 steps forward if both of your parents are still married. Take 2 steps forward if you grew up with a father figure in the home. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a private education. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a free tutor growing up. Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to worry about your cell phone being shut off. Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to help mom or dad with the bills. Take 2 steps forward if it wasn't because of your athletic ability. You don't have to pay for college. Take 2 steps forward if you never wondered where your next meal was going to come from. I want you guys up here in the front just to turn around and look. Every statement I've made has nothing to do with anything any of you have done. Has nothing to do with decisions you've made. Everything I've said has nothing to do with what you've done. We all know these people up here have a better opportunity to win this $100. Does that mean these people back here can't race? No. We would be foolish to not realize we've been opportunity. We don't want to recognize that we've been given a head start. But the reality is we have. Now, there's no excuse. They still got to run their race. You still got to run your race. But whoever wins this $100, I think it'd be extremely foolish of you not to utilize that and learn more about somebody else's story. Because the reality is, if this was a fair race and everybody was back on that line, I guarantee you some of these black dudes would smoke all of you. And it's only because you have this big of a head start that you're possibly going to win this race called life. That is a picture of life, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing you've done has put you in the league that you're in right now. When I say go, on your mark, get set, go! If you didn't learn anything from this activity, you're a fool.
Alright, so that video shows that from a sociological perspective, there's a lot more to it than what you see up front. So, as teachers, and you guys are experiencing kids acting out in class, try to be more understanding of why they may be acting out, what they're going through at home, what's going on in their personal life. And so, going off that, one big problem is teacher demographics. And so, according to an article by Brian, an overwhelmingly large majority of teachers in this country are white, middle-class females. And so that causes a big problem in educating young African-American males. So obviously, they've been... Austin, you paying attention? So obviously, they've been socialized just like many of us are. And so, without even knowing it, they have these unconscious biases against young African-American students. And so, these biases come down to split-second decisions. So when you're punishing children in your class, a lot of these punishments are done in split-second decisions. And so this is when our biases are most in effect. And also, Brian talks about the apprenticeship of observation, which is the idea that young white students are being socialized in the classroom because, say you guys are, discriminating against African American males, that changes white students' perception. Seriously, Austin, are you paying attention? Just go out in the hall at this point. If you're not going to pay attention, you might as well just be out in the hall. So obviously, if a kid is seeing you reprimand an African American over and over again, that's going to harm his perception of African Americans, and then when he grows up, he's going to be socialized to believe those things as well, and that contributes to the generational racism that we experience in America. And so, we're going to do two activities here to work towards, overcoming unconscious bias. Most interventions that people go through are ineffective because they're not skills-based. They attempt to change attitudes rather than behaviors. And so obviously it's very hard to change attitudes because when you hear something that goes against your pre-existing beliefs, your first instinct is to just block it out. And so the article from cultureplusconsulting.com makes the statement that behavior often has a greater influence on our attitudes than our attitudes have on our behaviors. So the way to go about this is skills-based training, where you do something, action, a behavior, and this helps you to change your attitudes. So I passed out a blank white sheet of paper and a small square sheet of paper. The first one is the big white sheet. Turn it sideways, long ways, there you go. And if you have a writing utensil, everybody have a writing utensil? Alright, make 3 columns down the page. So the first column, African American, second column, Hispanic, Third column, Caucasian. Alright, you guys all ready? So, you have 45 seconds, and nobody else will see this. Keep it to yourself. 45 seconds to write down all the stereotypes you can think of for African Americans. Start now. Alright, stop. Next one, Hispanic. Go. Alright, then the last one, Caucasian. Go. Stop. So I'd be willing to bet that your first two columns are longer than your third column. So this is a simple activity to help you become aware of your unconscious biases. That's the first step to overcoming them. And then the last activity that we have before we pass it over to Jordan and Cheyenne is called counter-stereotypic imagery. So now with the small square sheet of paper that I passed out to you guys, so on the blank side, you're going to, right now, identify a cultural group or race that you've had trouble relating to or identifying with, and put that group at the top. So now for the next minute and a half to 2 minutes, I want you to think of somebody from that group who you really admire, somebody who is an exemplar, someone who's very successful. It can be someone famous, it can be somebody you know personally. For the next minute and a half, write down a short bio about that person of all the positive qualities you can think of that they portray. Alright, so the goal of this activity is to strengthen your counter-stereotypical associations. So the first activity, you laid out your stereotypes and all the unconscious thoughts that you may have about certain groups. And then the second activity is to attack these biases and kind of put them up against the opposite and to strengthen your